So happy Wednesday morning. I think that we'll just make a start at this point. I realized that we might have some people who might join us later on. If that happens, we'll just bring them up to speed. But without further ado, I want to make sure that we make a start early on and work through the materials so that we also get through everything and are able to kind of try to keep as well as possible within our scheduled times. So like I said, this is the Wednesday morning and actually the final week of us covering new lecture material. So this week we will cover male and female reproductive systems. And then the week after that, it's going to be the exam 4 and practical 4. And then we'll wrap up the course for the finals week following that week. And that finals week does not include actually an exam, but rather a finals week project. And I'll be providing a little bit more detail about that project later on once we approach that. So right now we're just working through the final chapter of a material and through the final big exam, and then we'll worry about the finals week. So just a little bit of a quick review of things that I had lined up for today. And we'll do a little bit of changes from this because there's been some changes on my schedule as well. So we probably won't spend that much time focusing on the last exam practical. I'll explain what's up with that. But I do want to emphasize that for the due dates, this week, we are covering 2 modules. So this week's material is divided into 2 modules, Module A and Module B. So make sure as you are completing the assignments that you complete the assignments from both of those. So that's what I mean with the 2 sections that we're looking at. So when you're doing the assignments, pay a particular attention to that. Also, the material, like I said, is divided into those 2 modules. So we'll cover 2 sections. We'll first start by looking at the male reproductive system, which is really a little bit simpler and straightforward. And then we'll have a look of the female reproductive system where we have more material going on, especially because of the menstrual cycle and menopauses and gestation and carrying the child to a full term. So there's a lot more going on there. So we'll spend a little bit more time on that, but both are our topic and both do need to be covered. And I ask you to do the homework for both as well. So I mentioned or I hinted earlier on that I'll address the practical tree and exam tree a little later. There's at this time of the year a lot going on. I know for students and also for myself, I'm getting a lot of reference requests. So I'm hoping to have the grades up by the end of the day. So by the time we have the evening session, I hope to have changed this slide that the grades are up there. Grades are finalized. I'm just waiting for the last piece of work to arrive so I can release those correct answers to everyone. So stay tuned. I hope to have this addressed by the evening session. I also at this point normally ask you to make sure that you review all the grades that you have received so far. However, this time, because there is still some grades that I need to release, we're simply gonna skip over this slide. Don't worry about this. I'll talk about this next week. So don't worry about this just now. The grade review is not something that we're going to spend time. All the assignments that count towards the coursework grade for this course should be now open, and that actually does include also the finals week project. So you should be able to access all of those. It allows for any of you who wants to try to wrap up things ahead of the time to do so. I know that since our semester got extended by one additional week, since our spring break took a week longer than anticipated, some of you might have already other commitments and might need to try to wrap up based on the initial schedule. So if that is the case, you are able to do so. All of the assignments, all of the coursework are open, as well as the exams. So what I'm asking is that we follow, and I will come back to that. What's the final due date for very last pieces of work once we get to probably the next week, but I will need to make sure that I have enough time to finalize your grades as well. So I'll address that at that time. So what's really important, what I want us to pay particular attention on this week's material, is the fact that we're covering two sections. So on some of the semesters, these are divided in two separate weeks, but on this semester, we're covering these as one unit. So although you find two learning modules, one for male reproductive system and one for the female reproductive system, I am expecting both of these to be covered this week. So make sure that both of them do get covered. And for both of these, you have certain elements that you are already familiar with from the earlier on. So we have the Learn Smart for both, we have the quiz for both, and we also have the practical for both. So as you'll notice, there are double points for these if you add them together. So there's more points this week to cover. So make sure that you cover both of the learning modules. There is also one thing that's going to be a little different from our typical week, but not something that you would be totally unfamiliar with. We will have labs. The labs look on the male reproductive system about the forensic examination of the semen, and the female system, we're looking at the embryonic development of a human. And both of these are assignments that you will not be completing through the macro hill. Instead, you will be completing these labs through Canvas. So make sure that you notice that there are those activities as well. If you're simply working through the Connect, make sure that you also log in to the Canvas to get those. So they are just as important parts. And if you look, they carry together 20 points towards your final grade, which is quite a bit of points. So I really, really do encourage you to make sure that you get those done. So for the first lab that we're doing this week, which is the forensic examination of the semen, you will find that lab underneath the male reproductive assignments module. So look for the activity labeled as forensic examination of the semen, and I'm asking you to click on this document that I have uploaded there. It's a Word document, and once you download that, it asks you to do a little bit of a research, independent reading. I've given you the starting material there, and then type in your answer and resubmit that assignment, or submit that assignment back to me so that I can then grade it. Notice that what I'm asking you to do is the assignment here. Write a short answer. And I'm really meaning keep it short, keep it brief. I know you have a lot going on, and I don't want to put too much on your plate, and it's also quicker for grading if we get right to the topic. So I'm looking for about a paragraph or so. It can even be a little less, as long as you cover all the material. And on that short answer, I'm looking for you to cover each of the methods that are used for identifying semen samples. And that question gives you a clue that there's some differences. So I'm looking for compare and contrasts. What are the differences between these methods for studying the semen sample? And I really, really, really cannot emphasize enough. There is the little theory background that's going to help you to get started with that. But I can't emphasize enough that you can do outside research to this topic. If you do try to provide, always remember the references. That's always points. And the methods that we'll be talking about, there's three of them. The first one is using a black light. Second one is using the color screening test by using acid phosphate. And the third one is immunological tests. So all of these are the methods. So I'm looking for three methods to be covered in your answer. And really the big thing, if I was a student and I was tackling this, at this point, I would check the grading matrix. So check what we are actually wanting you to do, what's required for what kind of points. So use that to guide you. The second lab that we're tackling is going to be all about the embryonic development of the human body. And again, that's located within your learning module. This is the second learning module for today, or this week, and it's going to be the embryonic development assignment. Again, I encourage you to use the grading matrix. The grading matrix tells you everything you need to answer there for full marks. So make use of having basically the answers available by looking at what am I looking for, how many points, so you excel in these. And that brings me to the topic, the meat of this week. So we're going to be talking about the male reproductive system first, and then we'll have a look of the female reproductive system. One thing that we'll notice about the male reproductive system, like I initially already hinted, it is much more simpler than female reproductive system, and we're going to be looking at various tubes or ducts, and then accessory organs, especially glands. That contribute to these to the functions of the male reproductive tract. So I hope that that will help you to kind of orientate yourself as for what to pay attention. But I'm expecting that the male reproductive system is going to be quicker to cover, whereas on the female reproductive system, we have more complex material to look. So we have both the female reproductive tract, both anatomy and physiology to look at for that, because not only we want to be comfortable with the structures, the female reproductive system especially has particularly lots going on in terms of the actions, the physiology. Then we also have to remember that the female reproductive system, unlike male reproductive system, where it was all about just producing the sperm, And of course, we have the sex hormones. And we've covered pretty much the sex hormones earlier on. But on the female, we do produce the egg. And again, sex hormones are relevant. But in addition to producing that, we do need to facilitate the gestation and the development of the new life before the birth. In addition to that, we have the menstrual cycle. And we also need to talk a little bit about the menopause. So there's a lot more going on the female system. So the time that we're spending on that is probably going to be a little longer. So with that having noted, I'm going to jump out of this view. And if you bear with me for a second, we should be able to get to our weekly material. So what I'm reviewing with you is going to be a condensed version of everything that we have covered in the full lecture videos. And you'll find those full lecture videos, of course, on your learning modules. But these weekly sessions are typically just a kind of a condensed review of everything that's important regarding that. So I'm going to share my screen again. And at this point, you should be seeing the start of the presentation that we're focusing on the male reproductive system. But to be really honest with you, I think that before we dive in to the male reproductive system too much, we should look at through some of the very basic concepts that are important about the reproductive systems. So let's look at some of the general terminology that we want to be familiar with. So the term gonads refers to the primary sex organs. And you remember that by this, we actually mean testis for males and for females, the ovaries. So everything else is accessory organs. These primary sex organs are simply testes and ovaries. Those are the ones that we're focusing on. And like I said, everything else then accessory organs. So there's a bunch of ducts, glands, and of course also the external genitalia. So what's the function of the gonads, the primary sex organs? Let's think of that a little bit. I already alluded that it's the production of the sperm for male, for females, production of the egg cell. And bear with me just for a second. That's not what I meant to do. Now that seems better. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more luck now with the things running this way. So I was saying that for the primary sex organs, their function was really the production of the sex cells, which were of course our gametes. In males, sperm; in females, egg cells. But in addition to that, the gonads produce, of course, our sex hormones. And we've talked a little bit about the sex hormones when we talked about the endocrine system. And we'll definitely have a little bit more of a look of that as we cover this chapter's material. But remember that it's both the sex cell, either the sperm or egg. But in addition to that, the hormones are an important role of the gonads. What we're going to do to cover the male reproductive system, what I think that we should start with, is that we're simply going to review it part by part by part, using our own sketching abilities. So if you do have a pen, pencil, color pens, however you wish to learn, a piece of paper, you can follow along, or you can just simply follow as we discuss through these. But As you remember, our exams always cover an option that you can use your own notes, your own materials. So I would encourage you to do a good job of that, making sure that you have good notes that will help you. So what we will do, we will cover all these important structures that you see here, but we'll do it one by one so it doesn't get too overwhelming. So let's start keeping that in mind. And what we're going to start with is going to be the male primary sex organ, which was, of course, the testis. And let's discuss about the testis a little bit and think what we should know about. So there were twofold function that the testis had. And I already mentioned that earlier on. So the primary sex organ of the male testis produced the sex cell, which is going to be, of course, our sperm. But in addition to that, what the testes did, they produced also the hormones, male sex hormones. So both of those would be things that I would ask you to remember when we are talking about the testes as the primary sex organ of the male reproductive tract. And I'm going to use color coding as I work through these structures. But again, you use what works for you. There's absolutely no requirement. And if someone has challenges with the color vision, none of these colors are tied too tightly that, oh, it has to be this or that color. I'm simply trying to match them. I think I will eventually run out of color options, but we'll make a start and use different colors as far as we can. So the primary sex organ of the male, testis, and the function of that was the production of the sex cells, so sperm, and also the sex hormones of the male. The second structure, as we are following the path of the sperm on the male reproductive tract, that I want to do is the structure lying on top of the testes. And this structure that lies on top of the testes is known as epididymis. So let's add that. And what's noteworthy here is that when the sperm leaves the testis, sperm is not yet ready, it's not yet fully mature. So what it does instead is that it travels to the epididymis, both to be stored but also to mature so that it is finalized and ready by the time the sperm is needed. So twofold function there for the epididymis. It is the storage of the sperm plus the maturation of the sperm. And again, I'm just gonna try to do some color matching there to make it a little easier to at least initially identify these different parts. So let's highlight this structure and the structure that we will see here. So epididymis is a collection of coiled tube on top of the testis, and that's where the sperm goes to be stored and when it's needed, and also to mature so that it is ready and fully functional when it is needed and to be released. The next structure that I want to discuss about, let's have a look of that. That's a long tube. If you think about it, it is actually longer than we often end up thinking initially. So let's add that to this diagram of ours. And the reason why this tube is especially long is because of its relation to few other anatomical structures. So what we're noticing is that this tube curves over and to the back of the urinary bladder. And you'll remember urinary bladder from our earlier discussion of the urinary system. So the bladder itself is not going to be very important for us on this chapter. But what's going to be important is that we're able to relate the other structures to that. So let's just add the urinary bladder here. You'll see it as this structure here, and how this duct arches over and to the back to it. And this tube has few different names that you might be seeing being used. And these names can be either vas deferens, or it can be ductus deferens, or sometimes you might even see ductus deferentia. So few different versions there that you might see being used to describe this tube or as a name of this tube. I would advise that just try to be familiar with all of those, because you never know which one you see being used, but they all mean the same structure. They mean this long tube that leaves from our epididymis and then arches around, over and around and to the back of the urinary bladder. And what this really is, it is a tube, and it's a tube that's made of, that has muscle walls. So it's just a muscular tube. And if you think about it, then what we've learned about the various muscular tubes that we end up finding in the human body is that they help with transportation of stuff. And that's definitely the case here as well with the vas deferens or ductus deferens, ductus deferentia. So those muscle contractions of this tube assist with transportation of the sperm along this tube to where it's then needed. So let's just add that. And next, what we'll notice is that the vas deferens or ductus deferens, ductus deferentia, at the end of it, there's this little bit like a structure that looks like a little like an enlargement of it at the very final part. So I'm adding it here. It's not actually like anatomically or physiologically too different from the vas deferens, just a larger part. And this part is known as our ampulla. So let's add that to our diagram. Again, I'm just adding a little bit of color to highlight how it's a different structure from other structures that we've seen so far. So the enlargement of the vas deferens, ductus deferens. Okay, what I want to do next, now we're moving away from simply having these tubes in addition to the testis. We're actually adding our first accessory gland. And the first accessory gland is going to be located here, posterior to the structures that we have just seen. And it is gonna have a duct, then joining to the tube that we have already looked. And we're focusing now on this gland. This gland is known as our seminal vesicle. And if you think what seminal vesicle does, so far what we have had traveling has been only the sperm cells. But now we're adding secretions that make it semen. And I'm just going to correct that so that I have space to do all the remaining stuff. So I'm just slightly going to actually move this underneath of what we saw. And if you think about it, sperm has traveled at this point already a long distance. And sperm cells do use energy to propel themselves along the male reproductive tract. So at this point, we do want to give sperm a boost of energy. So the secretions from the seminal vesicle contain a lot of fructose, other kind of sugars that the sperm cells can use then to have that boost of energy to continue propelling their journey onwards within this male reproductive tract. The next structure that I want to add is actually a kind of a interesting structure, something that we find especially relevant for males and males that age. You'll notice that we've got all these duct from the urinary system, the continuation from the ampulla, and then where the seminal vesicle joined and dumped its contents to. All of these ducts join together, and they all travel through this next gland. And they travel through it. And this next gland that we're going to be looking at is going to be our prostate gland. And what we'll notice, especially in older men or men as we age, the likelihood of extensive growth of the prostate increases. And as that happens, what would result is these ducts that go through the prostate getting constricted, and that would cause issues with trouble with emptying the urinary bladder, trouble with the sperm and the secretions that get added to the sperm to make semen, of all of those from passing. So that's something that's quite common. Luckily, prostate growth is not usually a cancer type that would spread around, so it's very localized. So for that reason, really we do have fairly good prognosis on that, and what we simply do is take a slice away from that gland, and that allows for these ducts to open. Of course, in more severe cases we might need to consider the removal of the entire prostate. Okay, what we see then is that this duct that we discussed earlier, it continues, but there is one more gland that we need to know, adding its secretions to it. And that gland that we're going to look at is going to be this one here. And that's going to be our bulbourethral gland. And like you've seen before, when something's interesting or important in anatomy, we often end up having few different names for that, and that's the case here as well. The other name how you might see this gland being called sometimes is Kupfer's gland. So let's add that with highlighting as well to our diagram. I'm just wondering, will this cover the text? No, we can still see the text. I was worried that it's too dark of a color. But our bulbourethral gland, which is also known as Kupfer's gland, and that's this gland that we see here. And now we have covered all the glands. So what's remaining is, first of all, we have this duct continuing its journey. Now all these secretions result in that we no longer talk about just the sperm, we have semen. And I'm just gonna finish this duct here. If you really wanted, there could be a tube opening of that there. And let's name the remaining parts of this duct. You notice that I didn't give it a name initially, so we're calling it initially ejaculatory ducts. And then when it joins with the urinary system, we end up with the later part being the urethra. And let's add the coloring for this as well. And like I said, it changes from the ejaculatory duct to the urethra. So we're gonna color this tube to make that clear here. Notice how the ejaculatory duct runs through the prostate. So like we talked, there can be growth of prostate, which would then result in this ejaculatory duct getting constricted and trouble with emptying the urinary bladder and the passage of the material. So that might have also issues in terms of function of the sexual organs. And the final thing that I want to add is that you notice the final part, urethra, shared between the reproductive tract and urinary tract. There is going to be a tissue around it that allows it to swell in response to more blood being directed to this part, and that gives the male an erection for the penis, so that hardens in response as a response to sexual stimulation. So there's actually two different types of erectile tissue there, and we're gonna label them here, I think. And these erectile tissues are known as corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. So those are the two tissue types that we end up seeing there. And I'm just looking of picking a color that would be a color that we have not used exactly yet. So for our purposes, you don't need to be able to tell the difference between corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. I believe that in the practice anatomy, you'll learn more about the difference between the two. So at that point, you might want to pay attention if that's being requested. But for our lecture exam materials, I'm not expecting you to cover that. So that's the erectile tissue of the male penis. And I think that covers really all of the parts of the male reproductive system that I wanted to highlight. What we're noticing here is, and I'm just going to label this. What we're noticing here is that first of all, the male primary sex organ was testis. And then we have a bunch of ducts that carry the sperm, and then when we add secretions, the semen along the tract. And then we had, of course, these various glands like that we noted that added to those secretions. So that is the main points that I wanted to highlight about the male reproductive tract. So I think that covers that nicely. And if you followed along, you should have a diagram that looks a little bit like what we've discussed so far. If you don't have, let me know. We'll figure out what's going on there. But really, here is an alternative drawing showing the very same structures with a little bit different arrangement of the colors from what we've discussed. But the basic concepts are the same, and they're located there from what we've discussed. So I want to say a couple of words about a few other important structures that we should know when we talk about the male reproductive system. So first of all, let's have a look of the scrotum a little bit. So this is this muscular sac that contains the testicles. In addition, there is a blood vessel supply there and part of the spermatic cord. So our epididymis is located there on top of the testicles and testis, and in addition, the beginning of the vas deferens or ductus deferentia. This is really what we see as a part of the male external genitalia in addition to the penis. And it's located, if you wish, underneath and behind the penis. The reason for the scrotum to be this hanging pouch outside the abdominopelvic cavity is that this allows us to control the temperature of the where we're keeping the testes. And this is important for the optimal conditions for the maturation of the sperm, so that the sperm has a chance then to be in optimal temperature, which is about 3 Celsius degrees cooler than what our body temperature would typically be. So sperm production and maturation is optimal in this temperature. And it is actually divided from the midline into 2 compartments, one testis on each side. There's 2 muscles that play a role in controlling the scrotum and the testis of their elevation. So if we have hot day, they hang lower. On a cold day, cold conditions, they might climb up, for example, in cold water and so on. So the muscles that are involved here are our dartos muscle, which really plays role mainly with the pulling the scrotum closer to the body, whereas the cremaster muscle then pulls the testis closer to the body if necessary. So those are the 2 muscles that relate to there. At this point, it's kind of a jumping off, but I want to make sure that we are clear about the difference between the terms sex and gender. And I'm talking about these terms as they are relevant to biology. I'm not trying to dispute anyone's self-expression or how they identify us, simply in a biological sense, in a field of biology. Sex is what you're born with, that's coded into your DNA. That's the biological makeup that defines that you're either male or female. Very rarely do we have an individual that would be neither sex, or that would be impossible to define which sex they are genetically. Gender instead is a sociocultural norm, what an individual identifies themselves as. So it's important that we're clear of those two terms and how to use them properly when we're working through the differences between two sexes in field of biology. The next thing that I wanted to mention is just 2 words about the process called spermatogenesis. So the spermato part refers to the sperm and genesis refers to the production. So spermatogenesis refers to the production of the sperm. And I want to change the color there. Ooh. There's a lot going on there. So the production of the sperm happens within the testis, within the seminiferous tubules, but I'm going to leave the whole discussion about the controlling the number of chromosomes in the sex cells, so how we halve the chromosome number, to an other time. I think that that's not something that's going to be something that we would be focusing on. This course, you should have covered that earlier on BIO 181 or BIO 156 or some other introductory biology course that you have taken. If you need further review of that, I think that I have provided that in your lecture videos, and if not there, then on my YouTube channel where I provide full explanation of the chromosome number reduction in the production of the sex cells. I want to talk a little bit about the sperm on its own, about few key parts that we need to notice, and the proper term when we talk about the sperm that you might sometimes see being used as well is spermatozoa. So both terms are being used, so don't let that throw you off. So there's 3 main regions of the sperm. And I want to start with the first part, which is the head part of the sperm. And you'll also notice that it is the head part of the sperm that is really the largest if you think of the volume of it. So this is the part of the sperm cell where the nucleus is included, so the genetic material is housed in here. And we do also have the acrosome, which is really contains all of these enzymes that allow sperm then to penetrate into the egg cell, because the journey of making it to the egg cell so that the DNA can be combined there, that's the hard part. The next part of the sperm cell that I want to talk about, and that's obvious and worth of noticing, is the midpiece. So this region plays a especially important role in the fact that it contains a large number of mitochondria. And what mitochondria were, if you look back and recall back, they were the structures where the ATP is produced to the largest extent. And if you think, why would we have ATP being produced here? Well, it all comes to the function, the role of the sperm. And sperm's role is, of course, to travel to the female egg cell. And to travel there, sperm has this tail that contributes to the mobility of the sperm, so that waves helps the sperm to move along. And this movement burns a lot of energy. So that's why we have all of these mitochondria at the midpiece to provide the energy for this locomotion function of the sperm cell. And on that note, I think that that's all I wanted to say about the sperm. I have noted there also that the sperm lives in a female tract about 3 days outside the male body. And this 3 days is plenty enough time for the sperm cell and the egg cell to meet, fertilization to take place, and for the fertilized egg cell to then begin its journey to implant into female uterus. But sperm really lives in the female body outside the male for a good number of days, just enough to make its journey where the fertilization occurs. And when we talk about the hormonal regulation of the male reproductive system, we end up with a concept that we've already heard before: hypothalamic pituitary axis or hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And you remember the hypothalamus was divided into two lobes, and our hypothalamus was located underneath the thalamus, and underneath the hypothalamus that we see here, we have our two lobes of the pituitary gland. So we have our anterior and posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And let's have a look what's relevant for the male reproductive system and hormones that we need to know from there. Well, and let's start with this hypothalamus. So we saw that structure here. And hypothalamus is responsible for production of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then from the anterior pituitary gland, we have our specific male reproductive system hormones. So in this case, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These two are important from the anterior pituitary gland. And one more structure that we saw earlier on, of course, are testes. Testes were responsible for the production of the testosterone. So not just the sperm, but also the testosterone production is going to be important there. And let's just fix one issue. Now we are good to wrap up the male reproductive system. And last thing that I wanted to highlight or discuss with you very quickly about the male reproductive system was the changes in the testosterone, so the sex hormone production, and also production of the sperm. And what we see here on the y-axis is the amount. So that would be about the percentages of the maximum amount. And of course, on the x-axis, we've got the time. Notice that during the early development, the testosterone levels climb up as the differentiation between the male and female characteristics early in the development take place. And then once we reach the puberty, the testosterone levels increase as well as we start to produce the sperm, and sperm production really continues far into the adulthood, dropping only very, very late. So there's really a lesser of a limit for the male to become a father at the old age than what we saw with the females due to the menopause. So that's the big difference there to notice. So I think that covers everything that I had lined up that I wanted to speak about the male reproductive tract, and that leaves us to go through the female reproductive tract quickly. So let me just jump out of this presentation. In just a moment, it seems like my computer is really struggling this morning. It might be that there's just a lot going on. Let's try to get back. And I am going to open what I wanted to say about the female reproductive system. Excellent. So let me share that with you. So you should be seeing the second PowerPoint presentation. And here I want to just quickly cover the key points of the female reproductive system. You remember that we can see the full story in the full lecture videos that I provided for you in the learning module. So that should help. And let's just get going, and we should be recording again. So for the female reproductive system, really, I think that the biggest message that I kind of want to start with is just by emphasizing that this is going to be a little bit more complex system. So in addition to the production of the egg cell, we of course have to consider the female hormones, but also fertilization and pregnancy and the menstrual cycle. So there's a lot more to cover with the females and female reproductive system. And let's just start with some of those terms that we looked at earlier on. So the gonad, so the primary sex organ for the females is going to be the ovaries. And ovaries produce the gametes, which were the sex cells. That's going to be the ova or ovum. So the egg cell that we talk about, you can see that term being used as well. And there's certain sex hormones that we want to be familiar with, so estrogens and progesterones. And with the female reproductive system, we notice that the internal genitalia is located within the pelvic cavity. And we're going to be looking at the main reproductive organ, which is going to be, of course, our ovaries. And then we'll see a variety of the ducts, the duct system that contributes to the reproductive tract of the female. So we'll review those just as we did with the male reproductive system. And finally, we'll have a look of a little bit of the external genitalia, but the most of the business happens within the internal genitalia. So again, we are aiming to be familiar with the structure shown in this diagram. But however, rather than me just labeling this diagram, I do believe in making notes ourselves. So we're going to do a similar sketch that we saw with the male reproductive system. So let's go through that together for the female reproductive system. And we're, of course, going to start with the female primary sex organ, which is going to be, and I'm just looking in terms of having enough space for including everything that I want. So the primary female reproductive sex organ is going to be our ovary. And what we want to remember about the ovaries, again, twofold function. So first of all, the production of the egg cell. So the ova or ovum. But in addition to that, production of the sex hormones. So that's the functions of the female primary reproductive organ, which was our ovary. And again, I'm just going to use color coding to label these, but there's no particular colors that one would be better than another one to emphasize these structures. So what happens once the egg cell has been produced within the ovary? Well, what happens is that it gets shed outside the female reproductive tract. So there's actually no direct physical connection between the ovary and the next part of the female reproductive tract. So the egg cell ends up kind of traveling outside in the abdominopelvic, in the pelvic cavity especially, for a short journey. And what happens, we've got these kind of a finger-like structures of the female uterine tube structures, and these are known as our fimbriae. And it is the fimbriae that then sweep the egg cell from the pelvic cavity back to the female uterine tube tract. So I'm gonna add a color to those as well, just to highlight that structure. So these finger-like structures to sweep the egg. And then if you wish, the next part, you could describe it as a little bit like being a funnel-shaped structure that helps to direct then the egg to the uterine tube proper. Ooh, let me just correct my spelling error before I get any further. And this next structure is known as infundibulum. So it really serves a purpose of directing the egg so it travels to the uterine tube. So let's label that as well with our highlighter. So if you wish, this funnel cone-shaped structure, that was our infundibulum. Okay, next we're ready to look at the uterine tube, or sometimes you might see it being called also a fallopian tube. And there's few different parts to that, so I'm gonna draw those as well as the general uterine tube. So we'll have a look of those. And of course, all of these diagrams are always a little bit sketch-like, so the relative sizes are not completely to the scale, but they help us to kind of get a general understanding of what's happening. So we are going to have our... Oh, I didn't mean to do that. So let's look at what we've drawn here is the uterine tube. Now we have shed the egg cell from the ovary to the pelvic cavity, and we have grabbed it back to the uterine tube structures, fallopian tube structures with the fimbriae, and then the fundibulum was that part, that funnel-shaped part that directed it exactly where it needed to go. And let's look at a few different parts of the uterine tube. And we're going to start with the part known as ampulla. I'm going to move just my label a little bit so that we have room to, oh, I didn't mean to do either one of those, so that we have room to do just a few notes that I want to add in addition there. So I'm just playing it safe by leaving myself enough space for that. So the first part that we see for the uterine tube, kind of this wiggly part, this curvy part, is going to be our ampulla. And let's just color that so it's easier to spot. So that's our ampulla. And a couple of things, couple of notes that I want to share with you about the ampulla. This is, I know that it's not necessarily fully showing up on scale on this, but this is a thinner part and longer part. Of the uterine tube. And this is actually the site where the fertilization takes place. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but you might want to make a note of that. The site where the fertilization takes place in the body. The second part of the uterine tube that I want to include is going to be our isthmus. And if you think what's happening in the isthmus, or in terms of how it appears, isthmus is this more straight, thick portion of the uterine tube, I would say in length about 2 centimeters in length. So let's add just a little notes about that as well for the sake of completedness. So this is thicker wall. And if you are using metric system, it's about 2 centimeters in length. That would be about this sort of a length. So that's our uterine tube or fallopian tube, if you wish. So yes, I can bring it all together like this just to highlight that these all belong together. They're different parts of the uterine tube or fallopian tube. And now we are ready to move on to have a look of the uterus. So let's add that to our diagram. And uterus is direct continuation from our uterine tube. Uterine tube, and there's few different parts of the uterus that I do want us to notice. So I'm going to add them to this diagram. And let's start with the roof of the uterus, which is going to be called fundus. You might have heard that word being used elsewhere in other structures as well, other organs, but you'll notice that it typically refers to a roof of a structure or so on. So again, let's label that to our diagram. I'm trying to use different colors, but like I said, use whatever works for you. there's no right or wrong color for a particular structure. I just find it that it's easier than me drawing arrows. I've tried this in many different ways, making diagrams with students. So I find that this works usually the best. So the roof of uterus was known as fundus. Then the major part of the uterus is going to be our body of the uterus. So I'm going to add that to this diagram on both sides. So obviously you'll see that I've only drawn one side of the female reproductive tracts, since the right and left side would be in this diagram symmetrical. So I'm not taking the time to draw it again. And about 2/3 of this is going to be the body of the uterus. If you want to kind of consider the size or extent of that part. So I think we can add it to here. So that's our body of the uterus. So majority, same as you remember in other structures, the main part was always the body. I think that that still shows up. That's not too dark of a highlight. And the remaining 1/3 is going to be our cervix. So let's color that in as well. And again, I'm just looking that I'm trying to use as many different colors so we don't get too confused, but you use what works for you. You don't have to color it if you feel that labeling by arrows or something else works better for you. This is just the way I've found it useful to do it. And what we'll notice is that the cervix, the most inferior third of the female reproductive tract, that then extends inside the vagina. So that's how we're taking the cervical smears, for example, samples of the cervix as it enters into the vagina here. Ooh, I wonder why I'm sometimes getting my screen being so super sensitive. Apologies for that. I'm just highlighting here for the uterus, the different parts that we wanted to know. And finally, let's add the color coding for the vagina. It's going to be here. So those are the key parts of the female reproductive tract. And we can add that as a heading here. This doesn't though fully complete everything that I want to mention about the female reproductive tract by using this diagram. So I want to take us back to discuss what we talked about, that the ovary shed the egg cells, so the ova or ovum if you wish, and it is shedded outside this female tract to the pelvic cavity. So that's something to remember there. And this egg cell was then pulled back, if you wish, to the female reproductive tract by these fimbriae, these finger-like extensions of the uterine tube, then directed by our infundibulum so that it made its way to the fallopian tube or uterine tube. And what's probably noteworthy here is that it is within the ampulla of the fallopian tube. So here where the fertilization takes place. So the sperm travels all the way from here to the fallopian tube or uterine tube of the female, and fertilization typically takes place within the ampulla. So that's why we had the 3 days that the sperm could survive within the female reproductive tract. And now this fertilized egg cell travels to the uterus. So the fact that it's fertilized, it takes a little bit of time for the fertilized egg cell to travel to the uterus. This gives us the time for this egg cell to start the cell division, so it's ready and prepared for the implantation in the uterine wall lining. And then my question next would be that where within the uterus do we want the fertilized egg cell to implant? And the answer would be within the fundus or the body ideally. So one of these two. The reason why we don't want the egg cell to implant into the cervix would be that if this egg cell implants to the cervix, there is a chance that it then forms the placenta so that the placenta overlies with the opening of the cervix. And as a result of that, then there's a risk that the placenta rips off before the baby is born. And that would be, of course, very catastrophic and problematic. This is why also we do the ultrasound scans early in the pregnancy to make sure that the fertilized egg cell implants to the place where the pregnancy can be sustained within the uterus. And I think that that completes our diagram quite nicely. I'm just gonna add this highlight here so we notice the site of fertilization being the ampulla. And on that note, our diagram should look a little bit like what we're seeing here. There's a few other details that I'm showing in the next few slides. Here we also see the side view schematic diagram, if you wish, which is closer to what we saw here, just flip the other way around. But really looks very much like what we just drew together. A couple of structures that I want to highlight are the ligaments that are involved with the female reproductive system and holding the ovaries on their place. So first of all, the ovarian ligament, that's this ligament that connects the ovary to the uterus medially. Let me just change the end there a it's gonna look clearer. So you'll notice how this ligament band connects the ovary to the medial wall of the uterus. In addition to that, we've got our suspensory ligament, which anchors the ovary to the pelvic wall on lateral side of the ovary, if you wish. So that's known as our suspensory ligament word of knowing. And finally, we have our broad ligament, which really kind of lines over all of this as a kind of a flat, thin sheet, supporting the uterine tubes as well as the uterus and vagina. All of these kind of are anchored nicely with this broad ligament sheet or layer that we see here, if you wish. Another big concept that I do want to talk with you guys, which requires a little bit more time, but is an important concept, is going to be the hormonal control of the female menstrual cycle. And you'll be able to hear the full story in the full lecture video that I provided. So I'm just simply going to review it quickly here. What we see that everything starts once again with the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands underneath it, and especially with the anterior pituitary gland. An anterior pituitary gland secretes two different hormones. First of all, the follicle stimulating hormone, and what follicle stimulating hormone does, it has an oversight, controls the development of this follicle, and by follicle I mean the developing egg. So before it is yet an egg, we talk about follicle, the developing follicle. The development of that is controlled by the follicle stimulating hormone. The second hormone secreted from the anterior pituitary gland is going to be luteinizing hormone. And what you'll see is that as there is a spike of the luteinizing hormone concentration, which is the luteinizing hormone secreted from the anterior pituitary, that's around the day 13 or so, that triggers the ovulation to happen. So the shedding of the egg cell from this follicle where it developed in. Now what happens? We are left with this structure of the follicle that once the egg cell has been shed, and this structure now becomes corpus luteum. And corpus luteum starts secreting two different hormones. First of all, estrogen. And what estrogen, which is secreted by the corpus luteum, does, it promotes the thickening of the uterine wall lining. So the wall of the uterus gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And this is in preparation so that the egg cell that's hopefully fertilized has a chance to implant there and start growing. That new individual has a chance to start growing there, placenta forming, and so on and so on. So that's why we need a thick uterine wall lining. The second hormone that's secreted by the corpus luteum is going to be the progesterone. And what progesterone does, it makes the wall of the uterus glandular and very vascular. So we find a lot of vascular and glandular wall here. Well, there's two ways how things can proceed from now. If there is no fertilization, so this egg cell that has been shed does not meet the sperm and fertilization does not happen, then the corpus luteum simply degenerates. And as it degenerates, these hormones estrogen and progesterone stop being secreted. And as a result, the uterine wall lining is now shed and the menstrual bleeding takes place. So we get rid of this thickened vascular glandular wall that we built, hoping that the fertilized egg cell would implant there. But if that does not happen, then let's shed it, let's get rid of it. And this is what we see as the menstrual bleeding. However, if the fertilization does occur, so this egg cell meets the sperm, fertilization takes place, the corpus luteum gets salvaged, and we do maintain this uterine wall lining, which is then the basis for the fertilized egg cell to implant and develop further in. So that's really a short overview of the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle and the two possible outcomes, either the no fertilization or the fertilization, and how that then affects all these hormones and hormone balances that we see. And on that note, I'm just going to say a couple of words, not too much, to kind of wrap up what we were looking, highlighting few things that are worth of noting in the female reproductive system, and of course in relation to what we just started talking about, the menstruation. So the proper term when we talk about the menstrual bleeding is menses. So we're having the menses, and that all was to do with these changes in the uterine wall lining. The first menstrual cycle takes place about at the age of 13 years. There's a little bit of variation there. That's known as the menarche. And what we're noticing is we're seeing the first menstrual cycle to take place in modern females of our time, earlier and earlier and earlier than ever before. Reasons for this, there's a few different explanations. I think your textbook simply settles with proposing that that's because we have various hormones and we're exposed to various chemicals and so on from our surroundings. That is possible, that might play a role. The other reason that I propose is that we are getting better diet than ever before. So rather than just focusing on surviving and using all those resources on that, now we have resources to start to have to become to the reproductive age and start to have the menstrual cycle earlier than before. I don't know if that's the definite answer, but that is one very good explanation option. The other concept that I wanted to mention is the concept of menopause. So the official definition for the menopause is that the menstrual periods have ceased for the period of at least 1 year. That's when we say that an individual, the female, has reached the menopause. That's typically within the early 50s. And during that time, these secondary sexual characteristics might start to disappear. And sometimes we find that giving sex hormones might be useful on this for limiting these drastic changes and making it a little bit easier, this transition to the period of age past menopause. And there's various signs and symptoms, and we discuss them in full at the full lecture video. Finally, a couple of words that I want to mention just because it is important about the mammary gland. So we of course have mammary glands both in male and female, but they serve functional purpose only in the female. So it's the female that we're interested in. And really the function of the mammary glands is the production of the milk and milk to nourish the newborn. And at some certain stage then the milk is no longer needed when the individual has grown, the baby has grown, to move on to other kinds of foods. Mammary glands, if you think of them as a gland type, they are a modified type of a sweat gland made of approximately about 15 to 25 lobes, as we can see here. And I followed the path of the secretions from there through alveolar glands to alveolar ducts, lacciferous ducts, and nipple, and the area around the nipple that's colored is of course our areola. And that really completes the review of the female reproductive system as well. And at this point, I'm going to jump back to our weekly presentation in the interest of time. So bear with me as I do that. And it seems that end of the semester is catching up with my computer as well. It is running a little slower. It's doing its best. And so are we all. We're almost at the finish line. So let's make it happen together. And once I get the presentation up, I will share it with you. And any moment now, you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. And I think that we got here where we revised the male and female reproductive system. And we started by noticing that the male reproductive system was much more simpler than the female reproductive system. To wrap up, I do want to remind you that I am very facilitating about if you have any missing assignments, any missing practicals, or any missing exams, do contact me. This is your final chances to get those points. Make sure you get them. Once we are at the very end of the semester, there's simply no time to do those on the last week. So I really, really do encourage you, if you have something you want to attempt, message me, be very specific what it is. I've been receiving some requests for those, and I never say no. I want you to be able to get those points, but I do say no at the time when the grades have been given. So this is the time to wake up to that. In terms of the finals week project, we do not have a finals exam as such, because you have been already tested on all the material. So you don't have to worry about the final exam. You have already covered all of our course material at that point. So after next week, when we take the exam 4 and the practical 4, after that, you have covered all of the lecture material. So all we have left to do for the finals week is to do a little bit of a project that I've designed for you. And this project is basically going to be about looking at one particular topic of our course material, and most students prefer to do a little electronic poster about it. You can present the information in any other way that you want as well. I've seen presentations, essays, and so on. This project is your chance to earn extra credit. So it's not compulsory, but if you do want to bring up your grade and it's not exactly where you want it to be, this is a chance to do so. So I'm putting that option out there as an option for you to do. I'm going to be offering full details about the project probably next week, or if not next week, then the week after that. But I want us to first get through the exam 4. And I do remind you that we do have the tutoring available. You do not need to have appointments scheduled for that. That all is through the Cranium Cafe, the virtual tutoring service that we have. And as always, if you have any questions, all you have to do is message me. Usually the Canvas is the best. I've been also receiving a lot of reference requests recently. I'm happy to facilitate those. they take a little bit of my time, so that's why I'm trying to stay on float on other things as well. But I know it's important. This is the time when you get the applications in, so I'm more than happy to help with those references as well. And that really completes everything that I wanted to discuss this week. The biggest thing that I want to remind you is that there are two parts, two learning modules where the material of this week is divided both for male and female, each one in different learning module. So remember to do both of those. And on that note, I thank you for having joined me on this review session on the Wednesday morning. I do have the later review session later today on the in the evening, and I thank you for joining me. I hope you have a good week as we work through this very last final week of new lecture material. Let's make it a good one and let's finish on a high note of this semester. Thank you. Bye.